And it was weird. Like I almost had like a sense of loss
Yeah.
at the identity that I had assigned myself, but also like a feeling of renewal because I was like, oh no, this fits me better, and it's a complete match, and the jigsaw clicked into place. Welcome to ADHDerp with Stephen and Herv. ADHDerp, where whimsy meets focus with Stephen and Harv. Join us on a journey through the quirks and curiosities of ADHD as we navigate the delightful chaos of our minds and explore the magic with the neurodiverse world. Strap in for laughs, insights, and a sprinkle of randomness as we embrace the unique adventures that come with ADHD.
Episode 3, Stephen's Diagnosis Journey.
My process was completely different to yours. I always kind of knew that there was, like, I kind of described it as a bit missing. There was something that didn't quite click. It was like a jigsaw piece just wasn't there. And for years, it's funny you mentioned about autism. For years, I thought it was autism, and I thought I was autistic because there's a quite strong vein of autism running through my family. There's several family members that have different varying degrees of autism. So for years, I just kind of accepted that there was some sort of neurodiverse something, and just kind of developed coping mechanism and just kind of dealt. I never really looked into any kind of formal diagnosis. And I think, like, when you say about the depression and when you were a teenager, you were going to do it and then just changed your mind.
Yeah.
It's similar to that. I think I kind of decided against a formal diagnosis because, like, in my younger years, because I was kind of afraid of them telling me that I was quote unquote normal.
Yeah.
That there wasn't anything like formal wrong with me, and wrong is the wrong word, but there wasn't any kind of neurodiversity.
Yeah.
And I was just lazy, or I just didn't have the same coping skills that other people had, and that was just something I had to deal with. So that kind of was something I just accepted, that like there was something missing and I just had to deal with it. Then as I was in my 30s and approaching my 40s, and we made the decision to expand our family. And as we were kind of doing that, I decided that I needed to kind of take a bit more responsibility for what was going on. And there was many factors in this decision. But one of the main ones was that for all of my life, I've had a fear of driving.
Okay.
Anyone who kind of knows me will be very aware of that. Like, Graham, my husband, always had to be the main driver, or when I did start to learn to drive in my 30s, that it was a very stoppy-starty, not very focused process at all, and I did everything in my power to get out of it and absolutely hated the whole process. And would, like, sometimes leave the car shaking with fear and just absolutely hated the whole thing. So I went to a GP and talked about that initially. And I was diagnosed with general anxiety disorder, or generalized anxiety disorder, and was medicated on that, and that made a massive difference, like huge. It changed my life after the loading dose process, which again is something we'll talk about during the medication episode. But there was still it fixed some things, but it didn't click fully. So there were still some issues that I was noticing, that again I just kind of accepted and just dealt with. I'd gotten a diagnosis, so I was like, that should be me done. Why am I not happy? Why am I still having these kind of these things? So I was just kind of like, yeah, it's definitely autism. It's definitely autism. And there was one day, and I don't remember what the tipping point was, but I was in one room and Graham was in another room, and we were texting. And I said something to him about being autistic. And he sent me a screenshot of 2 lists of symptoms. So, sorry, I'll go back a little bit further.
Yeah.
People have said that I have ADHD for a long time, but I always just ignored it and said that it was. I've had friends who've said I have ADHD for years, and I always just kind of ignored it, and said no, it's autism. It's definitely autism. Autism's in the family. So then Graham, I think he just got frustrated, and he sent me a screenshot of two like lists of like kind of like checklists.
Okay, yeah.
One was autism, and the other one was ADHD, and I was like, oh, I have none of this one. I have all of that.
And did you know which list was which at this time?
I did, but it was still kind of like almost like a watershed moment where it was just like, oh, I've been saying this wrong, and it was weird. Like I almost had like a sense of loss. At the identity that I had assigned myself, but also like a feeling of renewal, because I was like, oh no, this fits me better, and it's a complete match, and the jigsaw clicked into place. And oh, and that was so. At that point, there was no dealing with it. It was just like, I have to go and get a diagnosis. This has to happen now, because I need to formalize this so I can actually do something about it. So we were at the tail end of the pandemic, the very tail end. It was 2023. But I was still very much enjoying the idea of a remote diagnosis, because I don't enjoy going to see people. So I looked up what kind of psychiatry, first of all, how the process works, costs, and I completely disregarded the possibility of a public diagnosis.
I was the same as well. I was like, first of all, it was almost impossible to figure out how to go about it, outside of kicking off the first step with the GP, but also the waiting lists were just insane.
Waiting and ADHD just do not play well together. So I was looking up, and I know that it's like not everyone is in the position where they can seek a private diagnosis, and our mental health system really needs to change and put more funding into that side of things. But I was fortunate enough to be able to explore a private diagnosis. So I looked up all the different ones that were available, that were kind of like approved by our health system, the HSE. So I got in contact with Dr. Martinez. He's based out of Barcelona, but he operates in Ireland.
Okay.
I think it's Dr. Jaime Martinez or Dr. Jamie Martinez. I'm not actually sure.
I always have that problem, with a Spanish Jamie.
Yeah.
Like, is it the other way?
I think it's Jaime, because it's spelled Jaime. I think that's Jaime. But Dr. Martinez. So I had a session with him. We went through all of the diagnosis forms, the tests, which was quite a rigorous process. And Graham had to fill in forms. There was forms related to my childhood. He did all the tests and the scores and all that kind of stuff. And he was like, "Yep, you have ADHD. Not so much like you've got extreme." Cross type, basically.
Extreme combined.
That's the one.
I'm on both sides of the extremity.
I have combined as well, but very much not on the hyperactivity side. Mine is very, very, very heavily leaning on the focus side. Or lack of focus, should I say. We did discuss depression as well, which is, there does seem to be a correlation there, but we didn't talk about it in any kind of big way, because we decided that how my anxiety medication was treating that was fine. And the other thing he diagnosed me with is impulse control disorder, which is its own separate thing, but is commonly associated with ADHD and will probably likely be its own episode as well. But he did that diagnosis, issued me the report, some like follow-up stuff, some recommendations. We have follow-up appointments, and we have a kind of like we have formal follow-ups scheduled, but we have informal kind of check-ins from a health perspective on a monthly basis before he'll issue the prescription for the following month, because they can affect blood pressure and stuff like that. So I have to record and measure my blood pressure.
And you're obviously on medication for the anxiety disorder as well.
Yeah, so exactly.
You got to be worried.
So we have to make sure that there is no cross impact, basically. That's not the correct word. You're talking about me using pharmacological terms, and I really don't. It's like, no, I don't know what the correct terms are, and most of the terms we use here will probably be wrong because we're both new at this. We're both kind of only finding our way and exploring, and that's what this is all about.
And that's not podcasting you're talking about, or drugs, or ADHD. It's just English you're talking about.
That's true. Yeah, we're like words. But yeah, that's my experience. It's been when you factor out the medication side of it, how the diagnosis itself has impacted my life, and how that alone has changed things. I think something that our respective species notice is probably something that we talk about this a lot more in their, like, from their perspective.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's that we talk about it a lot more. I think it's just, first of all, that we have a name.
Well, I mean,
for the jelly brain.
You don't talk about it more because you never talked about ADHD previously, before the diagnosis. So it's a completely new concept in this new world or post-diagnosis. So, yeah, of course we're talking about it more because it's a completely new thing. But you continue on with what you're saying. You mean in terms of just general talking about these types of issues? Yeah,
like talking about, like, factoring things through ADHD and what that means in terms of plan. Because we've always kind of planned things in certain ways. We've got, like, even down to, like, the kind of micro level of, like, house chores and things like that, and what that actually means, because there's been ongoing arguments all through our entire relationship about, like, house chores, keeping regular tasks done on a regular basis, all that kind of stuff. And it was always kind of like, why can we not just do this? Why are we not just functional adults? Why can't I just bring the bin out when the bin's full? That's
a really good point as well, in terms of the relationship side as well. Because you do look at other relationships, and even, like, from my perspective, looking at you guys from the outside, not knowing obviously the ADHD stuff and other things, but you're always looking at other people's relationships as a benchmark.
Yeah.
When you obviously you don't see what goes on behind closed doors, but I think especially for people in our situation, there is that kind of that feeling of less than, why can't I give my wife or my husband the relationship or the side of the relationship that they need and they deserve? And having gone through so many years without the diagnosis, without having something to attribute those issues to, cause all of those arguments. So yeah, sorry.
During those arguments, like, you're defending yourself, you're giving rationalization, you're explaining reasons why you didn't bring the bins out. But your self-worth is what ends up getting thrown out with the bins, because you're, like, constantly going, why can't I do this?
Why didn't I do it?
Why am I not enough? Why didn't I just get off my arse and bring the bins out? Why can't I just follow a list? Why can't, like, I have how many reminder apps on my phone? Why don't I use those? Why don't I use, like, I've made lists. Why don't I follow the lists? And it's like, in that moment when you get the report that basically confirms what you suspect, it's like, that's why.
Yeah.
And that's, like, I've heard people talk about, and this will be discussed during the medication episode, but I've heard people talk about when they get the diagnosis and when they go on medication, that there's a silence. That didn't happen for me with medication, but it did happen for me with the diagnosis, because I was able to go, that's why. I was able to stop asking the question and blaming myself and beating myself up and going, why am I failing here? Why am I failing here? Here's the reason. But not as an excuse.
Exactly.
And that's the key part. A lot of people think that when you get a diagnosis like this, it's going to be an excuse, and you're going to use it as a reason to fail, and you're going to use it as a reason to not do the things. For me, it's completely the opposite. It's an explanation.
Exactly, yeah.
It allows me to kind of work around and go, I know that's not going to work, so let's try something else. Let's try and build a different framework. In the same way with the medication, you try one thing, it doesn't work. With the diagnosis, it's completely changed how we approach those kind of, I suppose you consider them menial tasks of, like...
Yeah.
hoovering the house, bringing out rubbish, bringing out like shopping. Now I made some mistakes today, but that's a whole other topic. The like those kind of tasks, we've been able to approach them in a completely different way, and factored in, allow Graham to do the parts that I can't do, so it gives me the room to do the parts that I can.
Yeah.
So that's how the diagnosis has affected my life, and it's been fantastic.
Yeah, that was great, and there's a few things that I wanted to kind of circle back on, to introduce some corporate speak. I'm out of the game so long now, you know. I need to slip it in. It's
going to start coming back. Don't worry.
So yeah, just most recently, there's the arguments, the conversations, the self-worth. You mentioned like you're always on the defensive, and I figured this out before the ADHD diagnosis, was that most of the arguments that we were having were due to either one of us being defensive in a kind of anticipation of what was to come, you know? So we weren't actually arguing about a problem. We were having a conversation about a problem, and then one of us would get defensive about what we expected the other person to talk about or to feel.
Yeah.
And then that was what was spurring on the argument, which is just completely bonkers. And one of the biggest things that I realized was we're in agreement all of the time, but we're just not able to articulate, the situation from our perspective that's in agreement with our species. Perspective. And, when it came to that realization, the level of arguments just completely fell off a cliff. And this was pre-diagnosis.
Yeah.
So the diagnosis has only helped, to mitigate those issues.
Yeah.
And we do still argue, but rather than me taking it, as the end of the relationship and pure divorce, now it's just, okay, let's just... Well, we've had an argument. Let's move on with the rest of our day. Like,
hold on a minute, because that's something I didn't know, and that's something that like I've never really discussed with anyone. Something that like, and it's funny because it's kind of a benchmark that Graham uses for how successful the diagnosis and medication process has been. That before I had a kind of habit of being quite dramatic in these arguments.
Okay, yeah,
where like. Thrown the whole relationship out the window and like, this isn't going to work. It's like we're clearly not suited. And
did you do that internally or externally?
No, externally. Like, okay, right. It's like this isn't like we're clearly not meant to be together. Or like I'm going to pack up the car and leave.
Yeah.
And this is like Graham. It's gotten so cliche that Graham's be like, yeah, okay, sure, whatever. Okay, well, just come back to me when you're like,
when you've
come down off this. Yeah. Mad wound up tornado that you've gotten yourself worked
so
up
interesting
into. And that is what has simmered right down. And that's it. And so I didn't know that that's something that you also experienced, but it sounds like yours was internal.
Yeah, but it's so interesting like to hear that from the other perspective now, because like what would happen in those circumstances for me would be I would shut down and I just wouldn't be able to keep having a conversation. And I'd just go into myself. I'd stop talking, Rachel would be like trying to have the conversation with me or whatever, and I physically couldn't continue the conversation.
Yeah.
And all the while sitting in silence, there was one day I hopped out of a car on the dual carriageway just because I couldn't be in that situation anymore.
Yeah, nice and safe.
And now we were stopped, so it wasn't too bad. But and I would continuously be having this conversation, and it would elevate and escalate in seriousness the longer the silence went on. It'd be like, oh, maybe we should just have a break, or maybe she's not the right one, maybe I'm not good enough for her, maybe I should just move out, maybe all these maybes, and it's the worst thing in the world, we're going to get divorced, we're going to break up, who's going to take the kids, where am I going to live?
All these scenarios.
How am I going to pay for rent? All this kind of stuff, like literally in the space of a 5-minute silence after a ridiculous argument that didn't even need to happen in the first place.
Yeah.
So it's wild. It's really wild.
I found out from Graham's side that like when he has these arguments, he says the thing that's in his head.
No.
And then it goes.
Yeah. What?
You're talking about the festering silence. Yeah. He just expresses it. and then it's gone.
And even it's even more interesting because with the medication now, that while it's simmered down, it doesn't go away.
No.
Like, it's not a magic pill where my silence isn't filled with these things when we do have a serious argument. They're still there. They're just not as strong. And I'm able to recognize, what's happening in my mind instead of, going off that cliff. It's like I can pull myself back to reality and understand what's happening and why it's happening in my brain.
You understand what those thoughts are, what they mean, and that they're not necessarily your internal dialogue. They're like a fear response or a fight or flight kind of response. And you can characterize them for what they are and go, I'm going to come back to this later. You know? And like that's the kind of tools that the diagnosis process really helps people manage. That's not the tools they manage. That's the kind of tools that you get equipped with, and that's before you even look at the medication side. That's just purely getting those questions answered. And it's something like, I think if people have these questions in their mind, if they have like that question mark on, is there something here? Don't like there can be an inherent shame with looking this stuff up and questioning, is there something quote unquote wrong with me? Because people who have ADHD aren't inherently wrong. It's just something that is.
So a lot of the things you see now, there's obviously been a lot of development around the research and the thinking and the conversations around what ADHD is, It used to be called ADD, attention deficit disorder. Now it's ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And a lot of the research that's coming out now and the conversations that are happening now kind of posit that it's not actually a deficit disorder. It's a surplus disorder. There's too much focus. Yeah. There's too much hyperactivity.
I saw some research actually that I forgot because ADHD. And I was reading, like, it was kind of like a research paper, because that's what I do in my spare time.
I feel like that should be the new tagline of the podcast, because ADHD.
Because ADHD. Yeah. That's not something I do in my spare time, by the way. That's it was just something.
Is this in between looking up pharmaceutical dictionaries?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Oh God, never go into my search history. But yeah, I saw this research that it was similar to that it's not a deficit, that it was like something our ancestors used, kind of akin to a superpower, that it was like a way, like hyperfocus and hyperfixation were a way of protecting yourself. That if you could like over focus on things, like even in terms of hunting and gathering, you're able to last longer, you're able to bring back more, you're able to protect your family in that way. So there was some research that it's tied to like evolutionary bettering.
That's interesting. And so you're the one who's out there hyper focused on hunting and gathering and protecting your family, all the while I'm over here for 3.5 hours trying to make a fire so we can stay a bit warm, and my family's getting eaten behind me. Yep. But I'm so hyper fixated I can't even turn around to check on them.
But we're fine. I got my meat, you got your fire. So yeah, sorry, excuse me. I think that if people have the questions of should they explore this, there's no harm. Like, people should absolutely check out what resources are available. And I think what we should do is in the descriptions for this video, I think we should list both our separate psychiatrists that we used, because we both had positive experiences there, and some other resources like ADHD Ireland, which are a fantastic resource. Places like that. There's some other ones, but we'll list the one.
I mean, we've obviously come across a load in our journey, so we'll pop them all down below or wherever it is. And just to bring it back to the shame thing, when you're having these conversations like I did with, friends and colleagues and work, and just listening to podcasts like this where you're thinking to yourself, this resonates with me, this is my life, people are explaining, it's not a coincidence it could be a coincidence. But realistically, if you've gotten to the point where, you're feeling people like us are talking about your life, go and do it. You know, even take an online survey, even read some of the literature around it, and see if it kind of resonates even further with you, and be open about it. I was very afraid at the start to even just say it to my wife, and we have a very kind of open relationship in terms of conversation. We don't have one of those ones that I'm aware of anyway.
I'm jumping on that later on.
Yeah. But we talk about everything. We don't really hide much from each other. We don't have secrets. We've been like that kind of since very early on. But this was, I had a nervousness in bringing it up with her. And then even talking to the GP, that kind of nervousness, and like, they're just going to laugh at me. They're going to think I'm ridiculous. Yeah. And even then on into, how do you go about it in your professional life? Obviously, we're kind of out there now. You know, I mentioned it in a LinkedIn post or two a while back, but I don't kind of advertise it an awful lot. I do kind of think of myself as someone who advocates for mental health and things like that, but I don't advertise, hey, look, I've got ADHD. It's not in my banner. It's not a tagline or anything like that. But we're kind of opening up the door to that now with this podcast, which is, it's terrifying. Especially as an unemployed man, who's kind of struggled for the last few months trying to find something that fits. I'm putting this out there in advance of actually securing a new job. Yeah, is that going to affect my my potential employers? Is it going to reduce the pool of jobs that I'm effectively able to get into? Yeah. So it's a worry. But I think the only way to make that not a worry going forward is for people like us to be open about it, to share the stories. Yeah, we have ADHD. I've spent, 15 years of my career exceeding. Yeah. In many different circumstances. And that kind of brings up one other thing. That I don't know if it comes up an awful lot, in these conversations, but I think it kind of definitely resonates with me, and I think it does from an outside perspective with you, and it's resilience. I think people who have ADHD have this kind of inbuilt excess of resilience. We go through life with all of these issues and challenges, not understanding what they are or why they are, but we get through them. Why do we get through them? Who knows? But we do get through them. And, for people like myself and yourself, we've gone through school, leaving cert, college, courses, whatever we've done. We've both got beautiful families, we've both have our own houses. You bought your house, I bought my house. We've since had family changes that have resulted in different accommodation situations.
All part of the crazy few years you've had.
These are all huge, big milestones that, maybe people don't think from the outside that people with ADHD can accomplish. And that's a wrap on another episode of ADHDerpCast. We hope you enjoyed diving into Stephen's diagnosis journey and the random tangents along the way. Remember, whether you're navigating the daily challenges or celebrating those ADHD wins, we're here to share the ride with you. Leave a note to let us know what you thought of our episode so far. We're learning from scratch as we go, so tell us what we're getting right and where we can improve. Let's keep the conversation going until next time. Until then, stay quirky, stay awesome, and keep embracing your unique ADHD journey. Take care, and we'll catch you in the next episode of ADHDerpCast, where we'll chat with our very first special guest about their own experiences with late diagnosis.